Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual presentation of When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II with author Susan H. Kamei and our moderator, Teresa Watanabe. Before we begin, we have signed copies of tonight's book available. Susan was kind enough to stop by Vroman's last week to sign a couple of copies. If you would like to purchase one, make sure to write signed copy in the order comments when you're checking out your cart on our website. If you click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen, it'll take you to our website where you can do that. Also, we'll be taking audience questions towards the end of the event. To send in your questions, please use the Ask a Question button at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you'd like, and they'll make their way to the top of the list. And if you type any questions in the chat, I'll do my best to move them over to the Q&A portion. All right, so with that said, let me introduce our speakers, and then we can get started. So Susan Kamei received her JD from Georgetown University Law Center. While she practiced corporate law, she was a member of the legislative strategy team for Japanese American Citizens League in the successful passage of federal legislation that provided redress to Japanese Americans for their wartime incarceration. She has been recognized for her service in the redress campaign, which included volunteering as National Deputy Legal Counsel for the JACL Legislative Educational Committee. She currently teaches at the University of Southern California about the constitutional, historical, and political issues of the Japanese American incarceration and the importance of those issues today. And joining Susan tonight is Teresa Watanabe, who covers education for the Los Angeles Times. Since joining the Times in 1989, she has covered immigration, ethnic communities, religion, Pacific Rim business, and many, many more. So I'm going to turn my camera off and let our ladies take things from here. So enjoy the talk, everyone.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I just want to welcome everybody. I'm seeing people signing in from Singapore and Tokyo and Chicago and Silicon Valley and DC. So it's really exciting to have all of you join us here today. And Susan, I would first of all love to just congratulate you on this amazing book that you have put together. As someone who has covered this issue off and on for the last 30 years, and as someone whose own family was incarcerated, I really view this as the definitive compilation of not only the historical background of how this all happened, but also this collection of really heart-wrenching personal stories that you have collected and presented. So I just want to thank you so much for your scholarship.
Wow, thank you. That means a lot, Teresa. Thanks.
And there's so much to get to and so little time. So let's just plunge in right away. I mean, this is a book about a series of calamitous events that befell 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry 80 years ago when the United States was drawn into World War II by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And people may wonder why this dark chapter of history is relevant today. And you provide part of that answer in the opening quote of the book by Emi Akiyama, who was an 8-year-old girl when she was incarcerated. Tell us what Emi said and how that frames why it's important for people to know this history today.
I'm flipping to her quote. Of course, of course I had to find it. I'm always fearful that something like this might happen again. Not to me, maybe, but just in the world. I see the neo-Nazis. That scares me to death. And these ultra-conservatives, I think that they could do something like this again. Not necessarily to me, but to whoever will be vulnerable. I think I'm more fearful of racism since that whole experience. Well, I think part of the revelation that I came to and that I share in my course and I share in this book is the vulnerability of the decision-making process in our government, and how so many human decisions, personalities, prejudices, the backdrop of each individual official's lives. It all added up to this very bad series of decisions, of actions, political pressures, and how easily that could happen again, because we have a government that in the Constitution is of three branches: legislative, judicial, executive. Legislature is clear. We've got the House and the Senate. The judiciary are the justices, the judges. But then what is the executive branch? We've got the president, we've got his cabinet or her. We have to have a cabinet. We have the agencies that they direct. We have the military. We have the different branches within the military. So a lot of this is about that kind of constitutional interplay and how fragile that constitutional checks and balances system is.
Well, set the stage for us and tell us a bit about the Japanese American community at that time. You know, who were they? What were they doing here? And why did they become targets of racial animosity and hatred even before Pearl Harbor?
So the first generation of immigrants that came from Japan, the Japanese word that we use for that generation is issei, were folks that came starting in the 1880s, in large part initially to fulfill labor contracts for the plantations in the Hawaiian Islands and in agriculture and other endeavors here on the up and down the West Coast. And then others that came later as business people, as missionaries, as students, as family members. But those first immigrants, the issei, stepped into an anti-Asian environment that had already been set because of the discrimination and fear against the Chinese who had previously arrived. And so even as the first Japanese immigrants arrived, they were already walking into an environment that was anti-Asian at large. Then with the rise of Japan as a military power in World War I and the fears that were of global security, fearing Japan as a rising global power, and anti-immigration sentiments, not just against the Japanese but against all Asians and other immigrants from other countries as well, all added up to a time when there was before World War II, between World War I and World War II, the yellow peril journalism and this sensationalism of Japanese fear. And so the issei were not able to be citizens. They were precluded from citizenship. And they were also on the West Coast and other states within the US unable to, for instance, lease or own land because of alien land laws. Then there were the general environment of discriminatory practices, redlining, issues against those who are non-Christian, the issei being predominantly Buddhist and not Christian. So all of these factors added up to them really being the phrase considered forever foreign or always alien. Their American-born children are known as the Nisei, the second generation. And for the most part, they never visited Japan, didn't know anything else except life in America, straddled the two worlds in terms of being culturally Japanese at home, and helping their issei parents that in many cases did not speak English, but then being all American when it came to being school and how they thought of themselves.
So then came this shattering event, the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. What impact did that have on Japanese Americans, both in Hawaii and on the West Coast? and also in the halls of power in DC with President Roosevelt's cabinet, the FBI, everyone, the military scrambling to figure out what to do and how to respond.
Well, one of the points that I make in the book is that the Roosevelt administration had anticipated that there would be war at some point with Japan. And so they were already watching and investigating the Issei generation, the men who were the community leaders. And even before Pearl Harbor, they had already identified who they thought were the community leaders and ranked them according to levels of reason why they should be considered dangerous potential saboteurs, most likely to be loyal to Japan as opposed to loyal to the interests of the United States. They did not do this in any kind of scientific way. They were reading the local newspapers and clipping out articles and highlighting names of the presidents of the local associations, the local chamber of commerce, the teachers in the Japanese language schools, the names of the Shinto and Buddhist priests in the local communities. So even before Pearl Harbor, the Roosevelt administration, through the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence, had already laid the groundwork for if something were to happen, they would be rounding these community leaders up. And so even just as they got the word that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, the FBI started arresting many of these thousands of these Issei men. Hawaii was different because they declared martial law, and also Hawaii was different because so much of the local population depended on the Japanese Americans in their economy, in their industry. There was too many of them. It was the general in charge there with the institution of martial law pushed against any calls that they be shipped to the mainland. It was logistically impossible, and he ruled it to be not a good use of military resources. So the environment in Hawaii was very different from here on the mainland along the West Coast. The calls to blame, have someone to blame, and to the pressure to capitalize on the fear started immediately.
Well, I thought one of the most fascinating parts of the book was the way that you really detailed the political power struggles within the Roosevelt administration, where you had the FBI, saying that we don't think Japanese Americans are a threat. You had other parts of the military, Office of Naval Intelligence, coming up with, similar conclusions. Can you talk a little bit about this divided opinion in the U.S. government and what ultimately pushed forward the decision to incarcerate 120,000 people?
Yeah, well, I think it's that whoever the superiors are dependent on the information that their direct reports are feeding up to them, and what discernment that individual brings to either asking questions or accepting, rubber stamping the recommendations that are coming up from the chain. And so we have lots of examples of this where it was the loudest voice, the loudest, most recent voice in someone's ear. It was not having any reason to question or to see if there were opposing or different views. It was a lot of rubber stamping. And just relationships. Who did the president trust, and who did he listen to over others?
Well, I thought one of the more chilling quotes that you drew out in your book was when was it Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau raised the objection that if you incarcerate 120,000 people, it's going to create devastating financial losses to the community. And Roosevelt said, I don't care about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and in some of the other scholarships that I've read about Roosevelt as a politician, as our chief executive, was that he was very pragmatic, and that and he was also, as I give examples in the book, very motivated by California being an important state. He was up for election. He had 4 terms, and so throughout the book, there are many times where he stalled a decision or wouldn't take an action until after an election had passed. So he did listen to, apparently, the congressional leaders and the California governor and others who represented the political voices of a state that was important to him. It was part of his political base. So I think, he was, and just by his own the background that he had, I don't think had any personal connection with persons of Japanese ancestry as Americans, and was of that generation that only thought of Japanese as being from Japan and what that represented, and didn't think of them as being Americans.
So one of the most moving and revealing parts of the book is, in fact, the way that you wove together not only the rigorous historical research, but you really brought out the voices of these Japanese Americans who were uprooted and thrown into these camps, and had to deal with their lives that were shattered. And this is, you gave us a look into what they were actually thinking and feeling as all of this was going on to them. And it's evident in the very title of your book, When Can We Go Back to America? So can you explain why you chose that title and how that kind of reflected what so many of the incarcerees were thinking and feeling as they were sent first to the assembly centers and then the so-called relocation camps?
Sure. There was a story that circulated in the camps, and sometimes it's told that it's a young boy. Sometimes it's told it's a young girl. I choose to make it a girl, and it is having been taken from their homes and in a neighborhood, in a community where, as someone who's Japanese, they're the minority and not used to seeing around them Japanese faces or all Japanese faces, and ending up in the camps and then suddenly having this change of environment where everyone around them is a Japanese face, and then mistakenly thinking that her parents had taken her to Japan, because why else would she now be among so many people and not seeing anyone who's not Japanese. And so the story goes that she said something along the lines of, "Mommy, I don't like it here. I want to go home. When can we go back to America?" And what I think is powerful about that story is that as a child and therefore assumed to be Nisei, that the Nisei who were American born and constituted 2/3 of those who were incarcerated, that America that would protect their constitutional rights as citizens did not exist. And so when were they going to be able to go back to an America where their rights would be honored along with all other Americans? So the personal stories were really to show that, one, this was to be undeniable that it happened. There are those that question, oh, how could that have possibly been? There are those that think, well, of course, you have to understand, Japan bombed us. We had reason to fear. The phrase then was, this was a military necessity. Today we would call that national security. Or it wasn't that bad. The government photos show them in their best clothes, smiling, It was very careful to take pictures of very well decorated units within the camps, and to present in the government films on it that, oh, they went willingly, this was for their own protection. So all of these myths that were part of that government propaganda, have all added up in 80 years to have generations think that if they knew anything about it, they think all these things, right? That it was necessary, it wasn't that bad, it was for their own good. And so these voices were to make it real, that this happened to real people, and that there were real consequences, and that their reactions also were not monolithic. So you see different kinds of reactions, because everyone had to make their own decisions, had to reconcile their own feelings, and figure out how they were going to move on with their lives after the war.
Right. So through the use of the voices, you were able to really paint a very stark picture of what those conditions were actually like inside the camps. Can you describe what they found when they got to the camps?
So first, there was a stage where there were the assembly centers. And the assembly centers were large spaces that the government either controlled or could quickly control. And they were temporary, and they were just converted into being able to house suddenly thousands of people. So this was the reason why there were county fairgrounds in which they were using animal pens, or the racetracks at Tanforan and at Santa Anita, where they whitewashed horse stalls and moved in incarcerees into those horse stalls. Sometimes they were placing new barracks onto the parking lots or into the fields as well. Some of the assembly centers in more rural areas were the CCC campgrounds. In some cases had been abandoned and weren't even habitable, but they just started using them as these detention facilities. They were there through the spring until later into the summer and into the fall of 1942, because concurrently a new agency that was called the War Relocation Authority was building the 10 locations that we typically call the camps in interiors, places like Arkansas, Colorado, Arizona, Wyoming, and in California, Tule Lake and Manzanar. So these were swamplands in Arkansas, or desert, very harsh conditions, very extreme weather. The housing were barracks that were just lumber and plywood and tar paper, so that there was no protection really against the intense heat or the intense cold. The supplies and the food were poor and limited. The medical care was tragically inadequate. Many heartbreaking stories about illnesses and deaths because of the inadequate medical care. I have a whole chapter on education in the camps and what it meant for the Issei parents to try to provide and work with the camp administrators to create schools. But I think the testament to their spirit, their ability to endure, the word is gaman, and to do so with strength and with resilience and with grace, meant that they were just very industrious about how they immediately set about trying to improve their living quarters, taking scrap wood to make furniture and decorate, create gardens, just do whatever they could to make what was a very desolate existence as habitable as possible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, because on the one hand, you have these heartbreaking examples where you reported, I think the first week in, what was it, Poston camp, it was so hot that there were 7 babies who died of heat stroke that first week. And then by the same token, you have these very, very resilient people just, gaman, shikata kanai, it can't be helped. And they just turn around and they create gardens and they build schools and they just do all kinds of things to make the best of what they have. I mean, it was truly a testament to their spirit. So there they are, and they're just doing what they can, making the best of it. President Roosevelt had issued Executive Order 9066, justifying the forced removal and incarceration based on quote unquote military necessity. But you write that by June of 1942, when the U.S. decimated Japan's naval forces in the climactic Battle of Midway, which essentially turned the tide in the Pacific War, the Western Defense Command realized that they really could not justify, under military necessity, the incarceration of all of these people much longer. And so they went about trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to start releasing everyone? And how are we going to determine who was, quote unquote, safe to release? And that led to the infamous loyalty questionnaire. Tell us what that was and why that led to so much conflict and pain among Japanese Americans that actually lasted generations.
So the premise for why everyone of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast had to be forcibly removed, the government phrase was evacuated, was because that time was of the essence, and they didn't have time to bring individual charges or investigate each person individually to determine that they should be, that they were, there was some justification for thinking that they were potentially disloyal and would be candidates to engage in sabotage or espionage. So the whole rationale to move them out and to put them into detention was that we couldn't reasonably make these individual loyalty determinations. Then once there was pressure on because the war did turn around, there was pressure on the attorneys for the War Relocation Authority that the government would be now vulnerable to habeas corpus cases. And in fact, this was the cause of action in the Mitsuya Endo Supreme Court case, that I as a citizen have the right under the Constitution to have my case come before a hearing, and that there be charges brought against me that I could defend against, and that is, it comes from the Magna Carta, right? It was something that's very fundamental to the Constitution, that we cannot be held without charges and detained indefinitely. So they were very concerned about this exact kind of cause of action. And so now the government was in this quandary of having to do what the military had said before they didn't have time to do or couldn't reasonably do. Okay. So they overruled the objections of the Western Defense Command. In the meantime, the determination was that first, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, anyone who was serving then in the military, that was active service, that was Japanese American, immediately after Pearl Harbor was reclassified and declared alien unfit for service. And the military really didn't know what to do with the soldiers and the sailors who were already in the military at the time, at the beginning of the war. Then along the way, and that meant all other military age eligible Nisei men. Then along the way, the determination was in the military that, okay, well, they can volunteer. And that was the beginning of the 100th Infantry Battalion and the beginning of what became the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. What is little known is that many of those that later served in the 442nd were actually drafted. And they were drafted from the camps. And so in order to now determine that these Nisei men that they wanted to be able to be draft eligible and draft could be released from camp, the military and the War Relocation Authority conflated a couple of different questionnaires to have the same questionnaire for two different purposes. And so it was this confusion in the wording between anyone that was now seeking, because of a job or for other reasons, could want to have a hearing to leave the camp, and those who were of 17 and older Nisei males who now were eligible to be drafted. And so the wording of this questionnaire was so poorly done, as there were two particular questions, question 27 and 28, that caused the most confusion, because the way they were worded, it was, well, do you forswear one of them was, do you forswear allegiance to Japan? Well, so for the Issei, this was a trick question, because they only had citizenship in Japan and they had no citizenship in the United States. So they were concerned, well, if I forswore allegiance to Japan, did that render me stateless? For the Nisei, it was, well, I never had any allegiance to Japan. So this question is like, when did you stop beating your wife? Right? And so there are many, many other questions and implications, but those two became known as, if the men answered no to 27 and no to 28, they became known as no-no boys, because on principle, they were objecting to the situation, to be distinguished from draft resistors who said, I have no problem defending the country and serving in the military, but it needs to be the country that recognizes for my family and for myself our rights as citizens. Let us out of camp and then I'll serve. And so they were a little different category. But the ripple effect of the anger, the fear, was very emotional. It was something that really ripped apart the camps, and families wanted to stay together, all had to decide how they were going to answer these questions. So some of them ended up going to be moved together to Tule Lake because they didn't answer some combination of yes, yes.
Yeah, well, let's hear a little bit more about some of these different groups. You mentioned the 442nd and 100th. There were a group of Japanese Americans who argued that the best way to show their loyalty to America was to serve in the military, and as one leader put it, quote, have a demonstration in blood, yeah, unquote. And so the Japanese Americans would go on to form this all Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team and 100th Battalion, which became the most highly decorated unit of its size and duration of service in U.S. military history. And, you know, they did so much to change probably the minds and the hearts of a lot of Americans about Japanese Americans. So who were these soldiers and how did they amass such an incredible service record?
It's such an incredible story, and it chokes me up. It chokes me up each time. I mean, these are young men. These were 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, but also because of the demographic of who got forcibly removed and who was in camp, and it also included individuals who had college educations and were also slightly older. So they served, and some, of course, objected to the fact that it was going to be segregated units, and they were under the command of Caucasian officers. But I think what was really remarkable is whether they were from Hawaii or from the mainland, or whether they were from LA was considered the big city, or they were from smaller towns, whatever their background, that once they got over there, and they fought in some of the most bloody and heroic battles in Europe towards the end of the war. This was in Italy and in Germany. They just were bonded to covering for each other, and their motto was "Go for broke." It was from the Hawaiian pidgin gambling phrase of rolling the dice and going for it all. So they were just all in, and there's just so many examples, countless examples of their sacrifice and of their bravery and what they did for one another. They also, so Mike Masaoka, that factors into a lot of this history, was covering their stories as a public relations officer. And so what his goal was to be interviewing these young Nisei soldiers and saying, well, why are you doing this? You know, why did you leave? Why did you leave a life behind barbed wire, where you were imprisoned by a government that thought you were disloyal enough that you needed to be put into a prison, but loyal enough now to serve your country on the battlefield and in these really horrendous situations. And every single one of them said, because I'm doing it to show that I'm a loyal American. And so this was part of the information that was going back to the hometown newspapers, and then later for when the troops came home and FDR had passed away, President Truman was the president, and when the regiment returned to the U.S., then it was President Truman that acknowledged their bravery and said, you were Americans.
I think the famous quote is, "You not only defeated the enemy, but you also defeated racial prejudice at home."
Well, that was a nice thing to say. I don't know that was accomplished then.
Right, yeah. Because there were also Japanese Americans, as you mentioned, who resisted the draft, who challenged the curfew, who challenged the evacuation orders as unconstitutional. And it was Mitsui Endo's case that paved the way for the lifting of EO 9066. So can you talk a little bit about these conscientious objectors and what they, in the light of, retrospectively, they really stood up for what was right at the time?
Yeah, so after Executive Order 9066 was issued by President Roosevelt, the Congress backed that up with a Public Law 503 that made it a crime not to comply with the military orders that were being issued then pursuant to the executive order. And so what we have to realize is that for the Japanese Americans in the Western Defense Command area, it was a crime not to obey these orders, to report to the assembly centers and then to what we call the camps. These orders were carried out by uniformed U.S. soldiers, Army soldiers that were carrying guns and bayonets, and so for the most part, they felt that they had no choice but to obey. So among those that didn't comply with the orders one way or another, the three that became known as the test cases were Min Yasui, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Fred Korematsu. And so these were, when they went to the Supreme Court, these were appeals of their criminal convictions. And so in that regard, those three cases were different from Mitsuya Endo's case, which was a habeas corpus action. So it's hard to imagine now that there was a day without internet and social media. And at the time when Min and Gordon and Fred took their actions to challenge either the evacuation order or the exclusion order or the detention to report to camps, then they really did so as matters of of conscience. They really didn't know, and didn't, I don't think, necessarily expect that they would have community support, let alone any kind of legal support. Gordon had some from Quaker groups. There was also a very convoluted relationship with the ACLU, but for the most part, they were young men who just decided that this is how they were going to handle their principles.
Got it. Well, we have some questions starting to roll in. I have so many other questions. Let me just throw in a few last questions from me, and then we will open it up. So to all of those who are tuning in, please, if you have questions, please put it in the Ask a Question queue, and we will start taking them in a few minutes. But so let me choose one of the many questions I still have. But okay, so let's go with this. For decades, these stories they lay largely buried in the hearts of those who are incarcerated, untold to their children. When did that start to change, and how did that lead to the extraordinary and successful effort to win a presidential apology for the wartime incarceration and monetary redress to those who were imprisoned?
Yeah, very important question. So, so much of the reaction, especially of the Nisei after the war, was to focus on rebuilding their lives, putting the past. A lot of the Japanese culture is to as we talked to endure, and the Issei didn't want to burden others with their problems. So there was also the psychological trauma of the shame. There was intense prejudice after the war. Still, in fact, in many regards, the prejudice became more intense during the war. And so when they came back to the West Coast, there was even more animosity. So to just have their heads down, this is where the concept of the model minority started to kick in, that it was, they felt it was in their interest to just go along, don't make waves. I remember my dad, I think this is very typical for those of us that are Sansei. I remember many times my dad saying to me when I was a student, you have to be so good that no one could deny you. So this is where that perfectionism for it just can't be, you can't even have an A-, right? You just have to be so good that no one could ever deny you. So I think all these decades after the war, it was just all bottled up, and some of these things started to break through with the heroic work by Michi Waiglin with Years of Infamy, and this consciousness that in the Vietnam era of starting to question, okay, well, exactly what did our government do and what happened to me, and to start wondering exactly why did we end up in the camps. And so the Congressional Commission that was formed in the early 80s, one of the most, I think, important elements that came about because the redress campaign ended up going this commission route, was to hold hearings, and not just in Washington, D.C., but here in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Seattle, in areas where there were still the Japanese population of those who had been incarcerated. And it was just this dramatic, cathartic experience to get the Nisei who were still young enough to be able to speak to this crisply, but also had been so long that it was all this contained, suppressed emotions and feelings. And then there were these hearings, and it just all came out where they were telling stories that those of us as family members had not even heard. And it was this got national coverage. It was really there are many that say that was really the heart of redress, to have these testimonies, both written and those that were given orally. And many of the stories in the book are from those congressional hearings. And so that was the hole in the dam, and then everything just started to burst forth. I think that, as San says, my experience is probably very typical, where if we heard anything, the stories from our parents were random things. Many times it was because my parents were of the generation that was exactly high school students. They were freshmen in high school when Pearl Harbor was bombed. They actually graduated from high school in a camp high school. So they spent their entire high school years in these camps. And so they talked about the dances and being on the yearbook and being in Girls League or Girl Scouts. And so they talked about things because they were just trying to make the best of their young experience, and they didn't dwell on the things that were hard or bad. And so that was the opportunity, I think, to start to have both the efforts to record their oral histories, and as a community and as family members to learn what we could when we had the moment in time to do that.
Well, let's start taking some of our audience questions, and let's talk a little bit about the reason why you decided to dedicate this book to younger readers, because it's categorized. One of our questions is, When Can We Go Back to America is categorized as a young adult book. Why did you decide to dedicate this book to younger readers?
It was an important opportunity to provide a resource that really didn't exist otherwise. So often for young readers, and by this I would include high school students that could be very advanced, especially in AP US history classes. But really the only kinds of material out there were what I'll call picture books. So lots of photos, the USS Arizona on the side, and the scope of it is Pearl Harbor's bombed. There were these things called camp. People went home. Okay. And it was an important opportunity to provide, for all readers, the whole picture, and that the story certainly did not end after the war ended, and to make it relevant to why we should care today. And I think young people today care about that question. So it was also for those who, the material is out there in the world of so many things that are so many materials that are digitized, and we have the congressional record that goes back to 1942, and yet you have to know how to use those records. You have to go out and find them, and so what this format was an opportunity. In some cases, some memos and statements I've just directly inserted into the narrative. In the sources, there's a teacher's guide that's available online, but there's over 1,000 sources, and I think is the ability to provide a roadmap to the resources that are out there that would otherwise be hard to find for most students or other researchers that aren't going to have had the chance to develop a lot of familiarity with the records. So much of this is, I saw a question, yes, there were materials in the Bancroft Library and also National Archives.
Okay, great. So Diane asked the question, and I'm glad she asked this because this was one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I just didn't have time. About the return after the camps were closed in 1946. Was there a reason that some communities could return to their pre-war communities and others never returned?
It was probably a function of after they got out of camp, where they went and how quickly, if they did decide to come back. With Naomi Hirahara's great book, we were talking a lot about how so many of them went to Chicago, other parts of the Midwest. Jobs were there. The War Relocation Authority put resources into field offices to have a way to encourage those from the West Coast not to go back to the West Coast. Some, like my dad's family, just decided that that's the only place they knew, and they would just do what they could to start over again. My mother and her parents were from Little Tokyo, and they did not immediately go back to Little Tokyo. That's actually, they came here to Pasadena, and that's how she and her parents first came to Pasadena. But in some cases, it had to do, I think, with industry. So, for instance, in Terminal Island, the fishing industry there was just decimated. They lost all their equipment. The Navy bulldozed their homes. There wasn't anything to go back to. And so the Terminal Island fishing community that was very vibrant before the war was never reconstituted. Many of them that continued to work in the canneries. In fact, one of my paternal grandmother and my aunts, a couple of them, shuttled down to go work in the canneries. It was one of the jobs that was available after the war. But the local community on Terminal Island did not reform. This was the case in Tacoma, and so if people did come back, it came back in a different kind of form.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have time for maybe two more questions. Let's combine these questions from Jonathan and Angela. What were some of the challenges you had writing this book? And was there anything you uncovered that surprised you, since you have, researched this area so deeply?
Well, I think as much as I thought I knew, there's always so much more to discover, and that was very moving and shocking. One really amazing experience for me in my entire life was to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. and look at the files for my parents, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and as much as I had time for, the spouses of some of my aunts. And so I think for as much as I thought I knew, just more of the stories and more of the things that happened are just shocking. Things that would make me angry, but I just had to focus because I had limited time, and as a process later, just keep taking the notes, keep taking the pictures, and just some of the things that just really broke my heart, but also made me very proud. Just really came to appreciate their resilience. I was just so many pieces of evidence of just how much self-determination my father had as a teenager, as a young adult, just how motivated he was to get an education, and just how the family members looked out for each other. The sacrifices that my aunts made, taking care of my grandparents. It just the stories of what the 442nd and the 100th, and then the MIS in the Pacific. They're examples of their thought process and what they were willing to do, what they endured. It's just overwhelming. So challenges. I think the biggest research challenge was of the many fine books and scholarly articles that had already been done. There was this historic game, in some cases, historic game of telephone. And so to look at a particular citation or story, and look at the references, and then keep following the detective notes back and back and back, okay, well, where was that quoted from, and where was that quoted from, and where was that quoted from, to make sure that when I either hit someone's original research, in which case I had to believe them, trust them, or an original source, a newspaper article or a statement in the congressional record or something in the National Archives, and then try to find that. And in a lot of cases, I was able to, and then could bring it to citing the primary source. In some cases, it was kind of breathtaking to find out that things had gone awry, and what was being quoted was actually not substantiated by the original source. And so just to be, really careful and really diligent about that. And people would say, oh, but everybody knows such and such, right? But then to look at the source chain and decide that, well, no, actually, maybe that didn't happen.
All right. I think we are out of time, sadly. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Such thoughtful questions. And thank you, Susan and Teresa. This was such a wonderful talk. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience learned a lot as well. The chat was very active, so that was great to see. Thank you again to those who tuned in tonight. And if you tuned in late, don't worry. A replay of this talk will be available after the broadcast ends, so you'll be able to watch it from the very beginning. And also share it with your friends if they were unable to make it tonight. Again, we have signed copies available. To request one, just write signed copy in the order comments when you're checking out your cart on our website. You can access our website by clicking on the purchase link that's directly below the viewer screen. It's that green button right there. And I think that about covers it. Thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, have a good night. Stay safe. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.